Frankenstein begins with a series of letters from the character Walton, who is an explorer, and he's out in search of the North Pole. However, there's some dispute amongst his crew about whether they should keep going or whether they should turn back because it's getting too dangerous. Walton meets Victor Frankenstein out in the Arctic. It's so unexpected, they're miles from anywhere. But Frankenstein is sick, so Walton takes him in, and Victor starts to tell him a story. Victor tells Walton of his happy childhood in Switzerland and of going to university. It was in university that he was introduced to some radical ideas, and he becomes obsessed with the search for the spark of life. Ultimately, Victor manages to create a person, but not just any person. This is a monster. It's 8 foot tall, it's incredibly strong. And although he had worked so hard for precisely this end, once he sees the creature come to life, Victor is horrified and runs away. He becomes very sick after this and is looked after by his friend Clerval. On his way home, he learns that his brother William has been killed and that their family servant Justine has been blamed for the act. But already Victor is suspicious that this isn't all it seems. And then one day, he meets the monster he has created. The creature tells Victor his story of his initial innocence and then how he was brutally treated by the world. He says to Victor that since Victor is his creator, he is duty-bound to make another creature to serve as a companion. Very reluctantly, Victor agrees, and he begins work on this second female creature. But after a while, he begins to question what he's doing and thinks perhaps this could lead to a whole new race of creatures, or that maybe the female would not like the original creature. So he destroys this creature absolutely, and in revenge, the monster kills Victor's friend, Henry Clerval. The monster vows that he will be with Victor on his wedding night, and although Victor arms himself and prepares to fight the creature, instead the creature kills his bride, Elizabeth. Victor pursues the creature up through the Arctic, and it is there that our two narratives meet. Walton is with Victor for his final breath. But once Victor has died, the creature arrives on the ship and speaks with Walton. He is miserable now that he has lost Victor. He has lost, in a sense, his only friend, even although they were enemies. And there's nothing left for him now. He runs away into the Arctic, perhaps to die. Victor Frankenstein is the protagonist in this novel, but he's also the reason that all of the bad things happen. He is in many ways a traditional romantic hero. He's young, he's innocent, he's idealistic, but he's also disobedient. When his father, his family, and the teachers at the university all tell him not to pursue the line that will ultimately lead him to creating the creature, he ignores them. He is determined to follow this path. And even when it goes tremendously wrong, he's determined to face it alone, and at no point does he bring anyone else in to help him. He's entirely contrasted with his friend, Henry Clerval, who is romantic, caring, loving, artistic. He looks after Victor when he's sick. We're so familiar with the idea of Frankenstein's monster from the various film adaptations that we might have seen that we tend to think of him as a mindless brute who's just obsessed with violence. But this isn't the character that we see in the book. Instead, he's innocent, and at least at the beginning, he's caring. He was designed by Victor to be beautiful. So he has this long black hair and this pale skin and this incredibly tall. But when these parts are assembled on this reanimated body, they somehow come out monstrous. More importantly than that, he's incredibly kind to begin with. He learns about the world through reading books and then through interacting with people. And at first he wants to help. He tries to rescue the little girl and to do good deeds for the de Lacy family. But when he's continually rebuffed by humanity, continually treated badly, it in turn makes him evil until he is murdering without care for the innocent lives that he's taking. He is incredibly lonely though. And at first he hopes that Victor will be some kind of friend to him, but seeing that that's not going to happen, he asks Victor to make him a friend. In a lot of ways, he paralyzes Walton here, because Walton is also incredibly lonely, and Walton also hopes that Victor will be his friend. They are both ultimately left alone and isolated. Elizabeth Lavenza is Victor's adopted sister, and later becomes his wife. Like all of the females in this novel, she's incredibly pure. She's kind and she's loving, and she looks after Justine, particularly in her darkest hour. She always thinks the best of people. But unfortunately, like most of the female characters in this novel, she meets an unpleasant end. Both Elizabeth and Justine are victims of the creature in one way or another. Elizabeth directly dies at his hands, and Justine is executed for the crime that he committed. Frankenstein is written in the years after the French Revolution, and this was particularly relevant to Mary Shelley because her parents, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, were both revolutionary philosophers who were arguing for issues of the rights of men and women. The debate around the French Revolution was all about individual rights, and we can see the creature echoing many of these ideas when he approaches Victor and asks him for his own personal rights. But Mary Shelley had an interesting life in her own right. Her first child died very soon after childbirth, and many people look at Frankenstein as a birth myth and of anxieties about inappropriate parenting. The conception of Frankenstein has become almost as famous as the story itself. 17-year-old Mary Shelley, or Mary Godwin as she was then, was in Geneva with her married lover, Percy Shelley, the poet, as well as the poet Lord Byron, Mary's stepsister Claire, and John William Polidori, who was the author of the first great vampire story. This group of intellectuals were gathered, discussing the latest developments in science, such as Galvani's attempts to reanimate dead life, and they also challenged each other to writing ghost stories. The short story that Mary presented was the beginnings of Frankenstein that would one day become the full novel that we have now. A major theme in Frankenstein is the question of ethics in scientific pursuit. Victor is obsessed with this one goal of creating life, but once he achieves it, he doesn't stay with the creature. And we can ask ourselves, what would happen if he did? If, once having created the creature, he remained by his side to help him find his way in the world? Perhaps we'd have a very different outcome. At the moment, Victor does not accept responsibility for what he has done. We can compare this to Walton. Walton is trying to explore, to find the North Pole. Now his crew are starting to say, it's too dangerous, we need to turn back. But Walton is pushing them on. After hearing Frankenstein's story, Walton decides to turn back. Still, Victor says, another may succeed where I have failed. So there is a caution here. Don't be reckless. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue these lines and hope to progress. There was a great debate at the time about nature versus nurture. Do we act the way we do because that's how we're born, or because that's how we were treated? Mary Shelley was very strongly influenced by her father's philosophies, and he proposed that injustice creates vice. When we first see the creature, he is innocent. He is living next to this family, listening to everything they say and growing incredibly affectionate for them. He only wants to help them. It is simply the bad deeds, the cruelty that he experiences, that turns him into the murderer that he ultimately becomes. At the heart of this novel is loneliness. The creature ultimately wants someone to be with, and he is continually thwarted in that desire. As terrible as his acts may be, it's very easy to feel sympathy for him, because the family that he really tries to help reject him. Victor rejects him. Any chance of having a mate, having someone who is like him, is denied him. This, again, is similar to Walton. Walton writes to his sister, I bitterly feel the want of a friend. These are people who are continuing in their path, but they're continuing utterly, utterly alone. And the great tragedy of the novel is that right at the end, all the characters are splintered. Nobody has come together and found union. Where people have tried to be together, like Victor and Clerval or Victor and Elizabeth, they have been separated by violence. Frankenstein is an epistolary novel. It is essentially one great big letter, or collection of letters, that Walton sends to his sister. It is also made up of many different frame narratives. On the edges is Walton, he is our writer. But it also has then Victor's whole story, which Walton is writing down as Victor tells it. In the middle, we have the creature's narration, which comes through Victor. It's quite nice that we also see Victor looking over the manuscript and editing it, making the whole novel a collaborative affair. Genre-wise, Frankenstein is one of the first science fiction novels. We'd call it proto-science fiction, as this isn't a term that Mary Shelley would recognise. But it deals with interesting scientific, almost fantasy elements, but grounded in the real world. In terms of genres that Mary Shelley would recognise, it is very strongly drawing on the Gothic, but also upon the Romantic. For Gothic, we're used to getting great big castles, brooding heroes, fainting heroines. Here we have the supernatural element. We have the pursuit, the fear, the chase, but we also have a lot of romantic elements. Now, when we talk about romanticism, we tend to think of poetry, but we see the same themes here. The ideas of political morality, aspiration, and an awe in nature. All of these come together and kind of create an entirely new genre, of which Frankenstein is the first of its kind.